Hi, welcome, audience, for Housatonic Live. This is Paul G coming to you from a still photo because I couldn't get my video camera to work today. So, anyway, you get to see a photo from a few years ago. But we have a great guest on today with Mark and myself, and that is W. Scott McCollough. And he has a law firm based in Texas and has been doing excellent work and kicking the butt of the FCC up at the DC Circuit Court of Appeals for a few years. And so, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the lawsuits that have happened. And these are all the U.S. courts of appeal. And so it's a very important level in our court system. And I think, Scott, you could talk a little more. But the whole point here is we want to be able to get from an attorney who actually does the arguments a little bit of an explanation of how to think about the rulings that come down. And the rulings are, very narrow sometimes, and they say certain things and not other things. And a lot of times people who are lay people look at a ruling and go, oh, it's as simple as we won. Well, no, it's never that simple, right? And so you have to understand that if you get a favorable ruling, where's the teeth? What forces something to happen and what does not? And that's the kind of stuff we want to talk about. I was the one that reached out to Mark to say, hey, we need to have some just regular coverage of the 5G with no crisis involved, and just what are the strategy points and what are the things that local communities can do to protect themselves. And so he said, yeah, that's exactly what we need. Let's just water down the hype and let's just talk about what is and figure out what you can do. And so I've been telling him about what you've been up to.
So I started doing telephone rate cases representing small insurgents against, AT&T. This was even before divestiture. After a while, I went to the Attorney General's office, represented the state as a utility customer, did a bunch of electric and gas and telecommunications cases, helped run the state long distance and local network, represented, 750 of them because I was a general counsel of the Texas ISP Association. Worked with the National Association where there were, 8,000 independent ISPs.
What year did you run into Bruce Kushnick? What year was that?
Actually, that was fairly early on. Let's say late 90s.
Okay.
He and I made some filings at the FCC, dealing, in fact, with the independent ISP industry.
Okay.
Trying to yell at the FCC for how they were wiping us out.
All right. Let me take a step back because you and I could talk inside baseball, but what I want to do is provide some context for the viewers here so they have some idea of, how long this has been and the fact that Scott's been along for the whole ride. So he's got deep, deep experience. Divestiture, you mentioned it. Maybe not many people remember what it was, but AT&T was our essentially national telecommunications monopoly, and it was managed through regulation. And so essentially they were starting to harm consumers, and we got the idea that we should break them apart. And that's what divestiture was. So they broke up, there was a decision, I think, on Judge Green, and that was in the 80s. And then they broke up what essentially was Ma Bell, AT&T, Bell Labs, that did all the local calls, as well as you had to have a separate long distance plan. You might remember that. You had to buy two things, your local service and a long distance plan. And then when they broke them apart, they became 7 regional Bell companies, right? They called them baby bells. But as time passes, they've all bought each other, and now they kind of consolidated down to 3. So Bruce Kushnick was a telecommunications consultant, and he's a guy you got to have on your show, Mark. He's unbelievable. And he has done a great job on the accounting of what's been going on and how they've misused a bunch of funds. So we fast forward to the internet days, 95, 96, and that's just a huge attempt to ride the deregulation bandwagon, right? They just want to become more and more deregulated so they can just do business as they wish, not be forced to do anything, and charge all the prices they want.
If you're talking about the incumbents, like the now AT&T and Verizon, CenturyLink, actually, they love regulation. That's their home court. And their favorite trick is to use regulation against their competitors to put them out of business.
Perhaps because only they can afford people to write the regulation and understand the regulation.
Well, yeah, and they're like the Chinese. They think 10 years, 15 years ahead. And besides that, they own the joint. mean, when you fight with AT&T or Verizon before the Federal Communications Commission, you're playing against the house. Now, back then, we were talking about a circuit switch network.
Mm-hmm. Meaning copper, legacy switched copper phone lines.
Yeah, over copper. In fact, if we want to talk about history, one day one of my education clients came in and said, "Hey, put this in your computer." So I put that big old floppy disk in my computer. He said, "Bring it up." So I did. And lo and behold, it was a graphical user interface for the internet. It was one of the first browsers.
was this Netscape or before Netscape?
Oh, it was a Mosaic browser.
Mosaic, right. What was the first time you actually interacted with the internet? What year was that? Because I remember mine very specifically.
Well, in 1975, when I was laying around one day in Lazy Company out at Camp Pendleton, trying to recover from my wounds, this guy comes into the barracks, and he goes, "Any of you enlisted Marines, can you type?" And I raised my hand because my mama had taught me how to type on an old manual typewriter in high school. And he looked at me and he said, "You know, you're the only enlisted Marine at Camp Pendleton. Type, come with me." So he took me over to Staff Judge Advocate's office, and I was charged with typing up Article 32 pretrial investigations, equivalent of a grand jury. And every night after we were done, I type it up on an IBM Selectric, and of course you hit a button and it would store it all on a mag card. And every night I was in charge of running the mag cards through a machine and hook it up to an acoustic coupler and sending all the information back to Bethesda, Maryland, where the Naval Justice Department was. That was a precursor to the internet.
Right. And I read about the same time. 75, Schenectady, New York is where I was. And we had people work for General Electric, and they would bring these acoustic couplers in and do something because they were all scientists. And then I went off to college, and I saw this guy in the basement basically sitting down and doing chat with somebody in Dartmouth. And I went, "Come on, man, there's parties out there. Let's go." "Oh, no, this is really cool. You should see this. This is the internet." I go, "Yeah, but there's beer. Come on." And so I didn't really pay much attention then. And I actually made it through college without doing too much on the computers. Obviously, you could do some word processing, but on mainframes, not on personal computers. And then obviously, through the 80s, it matured and they let it come out. And, I think Mosaic made a big difference. And, we're off to the internet. So the internet in some ways was not really regulated in the early days because nobody knew what it was, right? So that's the difference.
Knew what it was. In some of the stories about why it was designed the way it was, not circuit switched, are true. They wanted it to be fault tolerant. And so, not have to go through central offices. So some of that is true. When I got to college, my last year undergrad, I was assigned to a biological transport lab. We were modeling the human body in Fortran. And every night I'd upload the code to the National Institutes of Health. Of course, at the same time, we were playing Star Trek on the.
What year is this? When is this?
1977 to 78.
Wow.
After I finished Bruce's case, I got a call and somebody said, "Hey, can you do this appeal for us?" And I said, "Sure, I'll take this one and done." So I do one or two appeals every year. And it was the 2019 FCC decision, Children's Health Defense.
Did RFK Jr. reach out to you?
Yeah, I spoke with him.
Okay.
Yeah, quite a thrill, actually. Wonderful people.
He's an amazing guy. I'm just so happy that you guys hooked up. I mean, because I really see you guys as Batman and Robin. You're taking on the world here.
So I kind of fell into it. I just thought it was a one and done. Along the way, I started learning about this stuff and all this wireless technology that I had been touting and working for, evangelizing for several years. All of a sudden, I started seeing the downside of it. And there is a big old downside, that's for sure. So, that's pretty much what I do full time. Just try to work in the wireless area, try to take care of the folks that are getting hurt by this stuff.
Right. And the point is that there's a lot of evidence out there that shows they are getting hurt. Now, one of the hallmarks of your case that you went in and argued in front of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals in January of 2021 was the work that you and Daphne Tackover and others at Children's Health Defense, with I get also the Environmental Health Trust, to put evidence into the FCC's record of harms from biological damages from radio frequency microwave radiation. Now, there's a wonderful picture on the front page of wireamerica.org. I encourage everybody to go. It is the printed out 27 volumes of 11,000 pages of peer-reviewed scientific evidence, which is what went into the record. And the beauty of you doing that for us, thank you, Scott and Daphne, is that we use that in our local records. I put that in every town I go into to help out. And all 27 volumes go into their record. And they can't walk away from that. So that was a beautiful contribution you guys made. So we want to thank you for all of what you're doing.
Paul's asking great questions, but this is a channel where the audience really does understand these issues and is really appreciating this insight.
People have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a federal act that applies to the entire country. Electromagnetic sensitivity does qualify under the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, they've been going not necessarily in the right direction. Then just like the right. Okay. I want to hear about this. So there's titles. Yeah, there are titles in the Telecommunications Act. You've heard us talk about Title I, Title II. One is for information services. The other is for telecommunication service. There's also titles in the ADA. And when people just talk about this, right off the top of their head, when they say title, you often think about the telecommunications titles, but this is different. So we're talking about Title I, II, and III of the ADA.
ADA Title I is in the employment context. So if you work for somebody and they sponsor or have a Wi-Fi network and it's making you sick, and you could show that as a consequence of exposure, you have symptoms that give rise to a serious impairment, then you can invoke Title I and get an accommodation. The first mistake that people make is they allow themselves to get into an argument over whether EHS or whatever variant that may be used is a disease or some recognized thing. You don't need to do that. Under the ADA, it's really about your conditions. It's really about whether you have things that cause an impairment. And so we don't have to worry about a diagnosis of electrosensitivity. You just need a doctor that says you have these conditions and they impose a serious life impairment. Then you have to establish the cause. And then you need an opinion on what the prognosis is and then what the prescription is. The prescription needs to be reduce or eliminate all exposure. That's what needs to be the accommodation. Similarly, Title II, that deals with governmental agencies, like say the municipal building or a library or something. If you can't go into those anymore because they have their own network, then you can invoke Title II and you can get an accommodation so that you can access the public services on equal terms with everybody else. Same arguments about, what your conditions are. Don't get into a fight over whether EHS is a real thing. Get a doctor to say what your symptoms are, what the cause is, and what the accommodation is, i.e. no exposure. Title III has to do with the service providers. In other words, Title III, if y'all think about, say, wheelchair regulations, these are the rules that require private businesses to have their, allow people with wheelchairs to be able to get around up and down the aisles, in between floors. It applies to private businesses. Well, it's my position that these wireless companies and indeed electric utilities with smart meters are covered under Title III. And if their service is affecting somebody, like the person who's right next to their cell tower, they're required to give an accommodation to. So the problem that people have had in the past is they start invoking Title II before their local zoning authority, asking for an accommodation when the zoning authority is not the one that enforces the ADA. Instead, they need to invoke Title III and go directly to the wireless provider.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it. Thank you.
Or they need to invoke the Federal Housing Act. That assumes that they bought their house from a broker or an agent. That's a condition for coverage of the FHA. If you bought your house through a broker, you've got FHA protection. And if somebody puts a cell tower right outside your house and you are disabled and you have these conditions, and it would effectively, constructively evict you, then you are entitled to an accommodation under the FHA, in my opinion.
Great. Thank you.
Third, the Rehabilitation Act. For a while, it really didn't apply, but now all these wireless networks are getting a huge amount of federal funding. Therefore, the Rehabilitation Act applies. Same situation as the FHA, except now it's just basically everybody. If you put up a tower, if the wireless company puts up a tower right next to your house and it affects you because you have these conditions, then you should get an accommodation under the Rehabilitation Act because they receive federal funding through grants. Now, my position is, and this is something that people just haven't been doing, is they just need to go directly to the provider. That's where they need to seek the accommodation. And they need to do it directly. Now, the wireless provider is going to say, we're not covered. No, go away. And that's great. Okay. You have your rejection. Now you get to go to court.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I think we're going to lead with this, Mark. Okay.
Yep.
This is some of the most important stuff right there. I want to just highlight two things. Electromagnetic sensitivity, EMS, is the term used in the United States and the one recognized by the Federal Access Board. Electrical hypersensitivity, EHS, is a term used like in Europe and other places, but it's not really a term that's as accepted here in the US. So we generally hope that people end up saying EMS in all of your communications that you need to. There are medical codes that actually will talk about this and the exposure to non-ionizing radiation and everything else that you can cite. So the good news is you bring the evidence forward.
The Access Board did agree that the conditions caused by whatever word you want to give it. I mean, we've used radiation sickness in our briefs. Okay.
Yes, that works.
But there are several terms. Okay. The Access Board has agreed that the conditions caused by this thing, which is recognized as a disease, are what give rise to the disability. But where people get hung up all the time, especially in the litigation phase and getting an expert, is you start arguing over whether you have this disease when you don't need to. It's all about the symptoms.
There you go.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Okay? Now, yes, there is a recognized disease. It's in the diagnostic manual. Okay? Yes. And it is called radiation sickness, by the way. But you don't need to worry about that. All you need to do is show that exposure causes you symptoms that give rise to a significant impairment.
Perfect.
Therefore, you get a doctor that says this person can't be exposed. That's the only effective treatment. Therefore, the accommodation is minimized or no exposure.
And so there's a very important part of the Telecommunications Act, Section 254K. And it pretty much says, hey, you might be a regulated company and you also might have some unregulated parts, but you can't use money from the regulated company in order to help out your unregulated parts. That's pretty much what it says. They call it competitive and non-competitive. But isn't that exactly what they did? And isn't that what Bruce Kushnick's been screaming about for years and years and years?
Yeah, it's cross-subsidization. Well known when you have horizontal and vertical integration within an industry. An enterprise like, say, AT&T, that has a wireless arm, an internet arm, and a basic telephone utility arm, with the corporate structure above it, with affiliates below, they're going to have a whole lot of costs that are common to all of their activities. And then they will have costs that are specific to individual activities. Then they deal with each other. They're called affiliate transactions. And the problem that Bruce has identified is really one that's very common in the old utility. It's the affiliate transactions, where the telephone company would essentially give free service to the unregulated wireless affiliate.
As opposed to charging a market rate, which they should have done.
As opposed to charging a market rate or a tariff rate.
Right.
And so the wireless affiliate is allowed to operate at a competitive advantage to somebody who does not have a local exchange carrier affiliate, like, say, a T-Mobile, and has to pay the full freight for the telecommunications facilities that are necessary to operation of their enterprise. And here it's principally the fiber optic cables and the service that goes over those cables between the towers and back up into their network core, and then to the rest of the communications network.
All right. Well, that's how I got to know you, because I was working with Bruce trying to raise money to pay for you to get up there and do it. So we didn't get all the way there, but we certainly appreciate you still getting there and making the case. But you did argue that is a case called the Regulators versus the FCC. That was in February of 2020. Is that correct? When you argued that?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. Now, look, let's just clarify that case. A lot of people say we won. Well, in reality, we did not win that case, but we got a very important clarification. What's that clarification?
Well, I've been doing this a while. And so sometimes you will strategically position a case that you know you're probably not going to prevail on, so that you can win as a result of your loss. Winning by losing. And
that's Texas poker, folks. That's what this is.
Well, it's just like a negotiation. You always give them something to take away, right?
All right. That's why we love you, Scott. That's it. Let's hear what it is.
But in this case, technically, we lost that irregulators case because, of course, poured us out on what's known as standing. It ruled that we, the irregulators, were not harmed by what the FCC had done in one of its accounting decisions. But the reason we lost on standing was because the court held that states, and specifically state commissions, did in fact have significant accounting and cost allocation jurisdiction over these remaining telecommunications utilities. And that came as a shock, actually, to a lot of these state commissions. They thought they had no ability to affect accounting and cost allocation, even for intrastate services. Turns out they do. And that was the win we got. We, although many state commissions are not picking up that charge, one of the things that they could do and what people can do is start talking to their state commission about the extent to which basic local telephone service, the copper wires, are being used to overprice regular old landline service, which still has a lot of value. There are a lot of people who want only landline service, especially those who are RF sensitive. And, they're being forced to cross-subsidize the very thing that's killing them. Their basic telephone bill is subsidizing the wireless operation, is putting the tower right outside their window.
Right. So just to take a step back here, because of this accounting clarification, states have the freedom now to rejigger it and take away this cross-subsidization, but they have to take up the mantle and they have to pursue it. It doesn't happen automatically. It's just a road that's available for them if they wish to take it. Is that correct?
Yeah. And a lot of people get really surprised when I say this, but let me say it. If the states were to take up this charge, they could significantly reduce the cost of basic local telephone service, wired, or maybe even, fiber optic, if there's fiber to the home. Significantly reduce the price of the basic voice piece. There would be no need for all of these subsidies that the federal government and many state governments are giving to encourage deployment of advanced services. All these subsidies, billions of dollars that are going to these folks, the industry, is not necessary.
You bet. They're already multi-billion-dollar companies. They don't need this extra money, but yet they're getting it because they game the system.
They've already got the subsidies. They've been bribed 3 times to deploy fiber everywhere. Every time they took the money, they put it over there and took it to the bottom line or over to an affiliate, and they didn't deploy the fiber they promised.
There you go.
And now we're doing it again.
There it is. It's a criminal operation, and nobody goes after them. And the federal government's in on it, and that's how it all works. So now we are, putting our fingers in the dike and trying to say, well, a lot of people are getting injured by this when you actually put an antenna too close to their home. Look, wireless service is important, and by law, we must have it. We must have it for telecommunications service. There are responsible ways to put towers into communities, and that's on tall macro towers that are far away from people. So by the time the power reaches you, it's very low, but you could still make a phone call. Where they're going off the hook here is they're trying to say, oh, I'll make more money if I actually spray wireless data and internet through the air, as opposed to giving it to you by fiber optic cable, like we should have done. And then when that happens, they say we have to come closer to your house in order to get that amount of data to you. And then that's when you run into biology, and that's where people are getting hurt. You know, Hank Allen, he actually went into AFib since January 13th, another 10 times from the wireless telecommunication facility that's 1,000 feet from his backyard. So he just had to go through a $150,000 operation just to try to stay alive. Right.
And he moved states. I think he moved to Idaho to live in a safe area.
Yeah, he was on a construction site. This guy is 6'4", 250 pounds, strong man.
Yes.
He was a general contractor, big guy, worked on a site with a cell tower next to him, and look, it injured him. And he couldn't do that work anymore there because, you know, often it was in front of a cell tower. So he decided to change jobs, change states, went to a rural area to protect himself specifically. And he sited a house that was 2 miles from a cell tower and bought it. It's beautiful. He's got bees in the backyard and fruit trees and everything else. He's raising a family. He's a great guy. And then some idiot neighbor 1,000 feet away leases out some space to Verizon, and game over for him.
Actually possible for a state to regulate internet service now.
Right.
As a utility.
And that's from the Mozilla decision, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. The Mozilla decision, for everybody, it happened around net neutrality, right? And we had a very interesting thing about the internet. And when it first started off, it wasn't really regulated. But then in the Obama administration, they were noticing that there were some bad actions being taken by the large players. So he said, can we recategorize the internet as something else to enable you to regulate it, FCC? And the FCC said, well, we'll try. So they moved it from what's called Title I, which is kind of unregulated, to Title II in order to make it regulated, and then to be able to say, great, now you can't block and throttle and do all these things. That withstood court challenge. That was all set to go, but Ajit came in and reversed it in the net neutrality order, which he called restoring internet freedom. And essentially he took that away, and that happened in the earlier FCC. And so that went to court as well. That's the Mozilla decision that came out in October of 2019.
And the net neutrality decisions were about internet access. Thinking about you at home, you subscribe to an internet service. It is the entity that provides you the facility over which the communications occur there at the last mile, and also gives you the gateway to the internet at large. Basically, the person who hands you an IP number.
Okay.
That's internet access, and that was the topic of discussion under all the net neutrality decisions. As you said, the commission has gone back and forth on whether to regulate internet access as if it was a common carrier service under Title II, rather than an information service under Title I of the Communications Act. The most recent decision, the one from Ajit Pai that you just mentioned, basically took it once again out of common carrier and into an information service. The DC Circuit in the Mozilla decision said, okay, you can do that, but that one part of your decision where you purported to preempt the state's ability to regulate internet access as a common carrier service for intrastate purposes, we're gonna reverse that. So as a result, while at the federal level, internet access is not regulated as a common carrier service, it is possible for states to regulate internet access as a common carrier service. California has done that to some extent, and that was recently affirmed by the Ninth Circuit.
Okay, so that's great. That was very, very precise, but that's really what we're saying, is that, yes, they tried to say, even though the industry wants to be completely deregulated, and they tried to say, we're going to preempt the states from getting in my way, the courts slapped them and said, no, if you, the FCC, chose not to regulate it, and you did not properly cite your authority to preempt, well, then you cannot preempt the states on this matter. And that's what they ruled.
Since the Pai administration had classified internet access as an information service, the court's ruling means that technically states can also regulate other information services as well, not just the access portion, but the information service as well.
So let's now fast forward and say, okay, great. So the net neutrality thing now gives states the ability to get in and do what they think is right, because really there is a cooperative federalism. A lot of people don't realize this. This was affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2005, and they cite the conference report for the Telecommunications Act as what is the intent of the act. And it's kind of set up like, well, all right, we're here at the feds. We're going to claim to regulate a few things. Whatever we don't claim falls to the states. States get a whack at it. If they don't regulate things, it falls to the locals. Then the locals can put in their own local laws. That's what a cooperative federalism is all about. That's why you can go to locals and ask them to pass better protective laws. And we've gotten some done as a result.
Communications Act is not complete field preemption. It is only partial preemption. Long before the internet, long before wireless, the Communications Act of 1934 very much emphasized what you just called cooperative federalism, where the FCC would regulate the interstate portion and the states would regulate the intrastate portion. And that still has implications for many of the issues we're fighting. Because the Communications Act is not field preemption, complete field preemption, the states have room to act. And when I say states, I also mean local jurisdictions. They are preempted only insofar as there is what we call express preemption or what we call conflict preemption. Each of these concepts leave a lot of room for local jurisdictions to act. The express preemption in 332C7, which says that states and local jurisdictions cannot regulate on the basis of environmental effects. And that has been interpreted, I think,
of radio frequency microwave radiation, as long as it's consistent with the FCC's regulations on the matter.
Yes. There are still some ways to deal with these issues at the local jurisdiction. For one, getting back to the net neutrality and what's a telecommunications service and what's an information service. Well, remember that the main driver for many of these small cells is not basic voice service. Indeed, most small cells, and particularly those that will be using millimeter waves, will not at all handle any voice. They won't handle any texting either. All that's going to be managed by a macro tower somewhere. These small cells, the bearer channels that are managed, but usually by a macro somewhere nearby. But the bearer channels that are going through the small cells are almost always going to be data, internet access, something else.
Which is information service.
Which is an information service and not a telecommunication service. What the commission has said effectively is, if this construction, if this site, if this tower will be used to any extent to provide voice or texting, then all of the rules in coming out of 332C7 apply, and the limitations on local government apply. But if hypothetically that cell system, that one specific small cell, is, as a matter of fact, only going to be used for data service, then none of Section 332C7 applies.
But where it gets a little funny now is what they're trying to do with, we're going to shut down what was 2G and 3G, and we're going to rename it 5G. That's all they're doing, is reusing the frequencies. And then we're going to shove over to Voiceover LTE. And Voiceover LTE has a different kind of way to function versus the regular 2G, 3G. What is that different way? And what do they consider that? Voiceover LTE.
Okay. All right. In order to really understand what's going on, you have to know how these various G's work. As soon as they can, they are going to go to fine charging. They're going to bill you by the bit. and they're going to charge you more for a bit depending on what you're doing with that bit.
Right.
The entire network has been architected to implement the social credit system. All that we need left is the digital identity to complete the circle.
And that's something they have in China, which is a terrible thing. There's a video for that right on the front of wireamerica.org. I suggest everybody watch it. And you do not want this to happen to America. But guess what? If you follow the data and look at the invoices, cities have already purchased some of the very same software that is being used in China to run such a system. And so you have to be careful.
American companies that set up the Great Firewall of China.
Right. They're participating.
Yeah.
And so are they going to turn it on us? I think that's the plan. And that's why we don't want them to build the grid. And that's why we're trying to get in the middle of all this.
The network was architected for it, and they started 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Okay.
When they started designing LTE and now 4G, now 5G, and very soon 6G. It's a surveillance network.
Yep. The Technology Advisory Council for the FCC just set up a nice little working group for 6G. It was just staffed. And now they're having these meetings that you can watch and they can talk about it. And so I guess I say to everybody, listen, don't talk about the Gs. The Gs are just marketing terms, right?
It is.
It is just essentially a way for them to add additional features and granularity and surveillance capabilities to a very invasive network, and to be able to blast this all the time so they could shut anybody down in real time if they want.
Well, there is something behind the Gs because, within the industry, there are standards organizations. For example, 5G was standard come from the 3GPP, the third generation partnership, with some help from IEEE and the internet side. So there are standards behind each of these Gs, and there are, in fact, network architecture differences that occur. We have made a complete transition to digital now. There's no more analog. But, there is something different between 4G, 5G, and 6G.
Yeah, they're technical differences.
More insidious is the purpose behind many of the things that are happening.
Correct. But I think also is just the marketing is that people latch on to something and they go, oh, it sounds like 5G is bad. So, the whole point is we got to stop 5G. But hey, here's all your 4G. We'll let that in. The answer is all of the Gs have their downsides, all of it depending on microwave radiation. And so it doesn't help you if they tell you at a city council meeting, don't worry, it's not 5G, it's only 4G. Or, oh, guess what? Nobody liked 5G, so we're going to go to 6G. You see, it's all still done with a bunch of microwave radiation that's pulsed and modulated in order to transport data through the air. It's essentially sending electromagnetic power through the air. Now, we had this problem with radio stations, right? When in the 1934 Communications Act, we have another section, 324, which says specifically all radio stations shall use the minimum amount of power for the communication desired. And in fact, every cell tower, correct me if I'm wrong, is considered a radio station, is it not?
Yes.
Therefore, shouldn't every cell tower use the minimum amount of power required for the communication desired? And in the 1996 Telecommunications Act, this is for telecommunications service, not information service. Therefore, we already know what is the minimum amount of power required for phone calls. It's very, very low. It is 0.002 microwatts per square meter, which equates to minus 85 decibel milliwatt dBm. If you have that, you have 5 bars on a cell phone. That's sufficient for telecommunication service.
Let me jump in because I think I know where you're going.
I saw Scott. I saw Scott squint a couple times when you were speaking there, Paul.
Oh, that's all right.
So I think he wants to clarify a few things.
We want all the clarity we can get. We want to talk about things accurately. We appreciate Scott's viewpoints on this.
I do. A tower is not a radio station. The transmitting equipment that is hung on the tower, and even more specifically, the particular part of the antenna that is using a frequency band. You need a radio station authorization for licensed services. And so the radio station is associated with a particular frequency band.
Right. Isn't that similar to an FCC license to transmit 600 megahertz? Yes. You need an RSA. There you go.
With each new generation, you are getting far more facile ability to modulate and pulsate. And it is all for the stated purpose of being able to push more information through the straw, so to speak. One of the problems, and especially the health problems, is what does that do to living things? Modulation and pulsation is one of the primary triggers for many of these health illnesses that we have seen. And so with each generation, it's getting worse. We're seeing far stronger pulsation, far more active modulation, and many more health effects. The only difference is that the old CDMA networks were particularly bad under 3G. The bad news is that 6G is going to be using a lot of CDMA type technology. And so we're going to be back to signal-based modulation rather than tone-based.
Interesting, because I mean, just this couple of weeks, so let me tell you two things that happened. A friend of mine was being forced to upgrade his cell phone because he was a Sprint customer and his iPhone was locked to the Sprint CDMA network because there was a merger. They're shutting down the Sprint CDMA network and moving everybody over to T-Mobile GSM. His phone would no longer work at the end of the month. He was being forced to buy a new phone. Now, I myself lost my phone in November, and I didn't replace it since November. I lived without it for about 3-4 months to see what it'd be like. And I kind of want to stay that way, but my family wants me to get a phone. So guess what I did? I went and bought the Truth phone. What's the Truth phone? That's the phone where Apple said to Verizon, look, your millimeter wave thing is nothing. You can't force us to put this millimeter wave antenna in any longer. It's just got extra cost, and we don't want to charge that to the customer. We're going to put out the new iPhone SE. I bought one, and I can confirm for everyone, it does no millimeter wave whatsoever. And all the analysts are saying, well, that's a requirement for Verizon. That means they're not going to carry the phone, right? Verizon said, no, we'll carry it. So their admission was it was a big fat lie that we ever needed millimeter wave. They're not even doing it any longer. It might be in a stadium here and there. It might be in a few little venues just to brag, but it's not coming to your town because it doesn't work very well. It doesn't penetrate buildings. It doesn't go very far. And there is no reason for them to be on utility poles in front of your house. That was just a lie to get there. So that's what you can really point to. Mainstream media is pointing out it was a big fat lie from the very beginning, and you don't have to go along with it.
The problem with small cells, and I've always not understood the economics of how they could actually work. They chose wireless to begin with because of the cost of the last quarter mile. At least they said. But now they are extending the wireless network until it is virtually right by your curb.
Well, let's be very accurate. They're extending the fiber optic network right to my curb. And instead of going an extra 30 feet to my house, they're stopping short to spray it at me.
Cable.
Yeah.
With the coaxial cable.
Right.
Because you're typically now within 300 feet.
Sure.
And so you could run, Ethernet cable or coaxial cable to almost any building and still provide, gigabit service.
Well, that's what we say to local towns. They say, listen, what is conduit in a neighborhood? Conduit is in the public rights of way. Guess what that should have? Public benefit. What should that include? Access to any fiber that's coming through there so you can connect up your Ethernet or coaxial directly to it. There you go. Now we don't have to sit there and buy your service from wireless. We can actually go right to the fiber that's coming into our neighborhood if we wish. And you need to open that up and allow a provider to do that.